neighborhood-centric, neighborhood-based, place-based is I believe, the most likely way to break through chronic, multi-generational disinvestment and poverty in an urban setting like Atlanta.
Welcome to Place Matters, a podcast about the intersection of race, place, and poverty. We will explore the belief that the path towards ending inequity and promoting prosperity is through the work of holistic neighborhood development. The content for this podcast is based on over 45 years of experience, expertise, failure, and hope from our organization, Focused Community Strategies, better known as FCS. This is the Foundations series, where we will talk about the big ideas and core frameworks that make FCS, well, FCS. I am Shawn Duncan, the Director of Training and Consulting for FCS and the host for Place Matters. Cities are known for their energy, opportunity, and culture, but they are also known for the disparities. In our own city of Atlanta, we are seeing rapid growth and a growing national and international platform for our music, our innovation, and our culture. But in Atlanta, we are also seeing how growing up in one neighborhood versus another means taking 10 years off your life expectancy. It means drastically increasing the chances of your child having asthma. And it means profoundly reducing one's economic mobility. When most people think about what cities need or what will make cities better, they often talk about safety and policing, traffic and highways, or affordability and housing. Rarely do they talk about the state of our neighborhoods or what it would look like to build equity, access, and opportunity into the very fabric of how our neighborhoods work. How can cities begin to place neighborhoods as a center of their plans for growth and change? What does it take to make cities places where all people have the chance to flourish? Joining me today in this conversation is Shirley Franklin, the 58th mayor of the great city of Atlanta, and David Edwards, who is the neighborhood policy advisor for the current mayor of Atlanta, Andre Dickens. Both have been a part of Purpose-Built Communities, a nationwide network of place-based development organizations of which FCS is a proud member. During their time with Purpose-Built, David served as a CEO and Shirley as the executive board chair. So tell me how the two of you came to embrace this place-based perspective on poverty alleviation.
Well, I think, Shirley, you should start that because your work at Eastlake predated my involvement in this.
So you were working on banking before that?
Yeah, I was working on telecommunications and unrelated to neighborhoods.
Okay, I wanted to go on record just to say you're a new convert.
Exactly.
I had a chance to work at the Eastlake Foundation.
Okay.
I was approached by one of Tom Cousin's top advisors, a gentleman named Walter Ashmore.
Okay.
But Walter really was on the construction side of the Eastlake project. And he called around and said, I need to talk to somebody who understands how to relate to communities.
Okay.
I had just left, I'd worked at the Olympics, and I'd also worked for Andrew Young and Maynard Jackson.
Okay.
So somehow or another, he landed with me. And he introduced me to Greg Giornelli.
Okay, yep.
And that was my first time actually understanding the model that they were developing. They said they had a model, but we now know it was a developing model.
Okay.
And that would have been in 96, 97.
Okay.
And Greg offered to hire me as a consultant on an hourly basis, like a lawyer or an accountant or something.
Good deal.
And I turned him down.
Oh, wow.
And said, no, I don't work that way. But I like this enough. I'm curious enough about what you're doing that I'll work for free.
Oh, wow.
And
Meanwhile, let me take your number after this. If you're consulting for free,
So this is kind of a long intro.
Yeah, this is great.
So I studied sociology, psychology, and anthropology in college.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And African studies. Those were kind of my areas of focus. So I've been interested in how groups of people relate to each other since I was 17 and 18 years old. Got an undergraduate degree and a master's in sociology. So my primary interest in life has been how do groups of people and cultures relate to each other. Wow. So when I heard about this at Eastlake, I was intrigued because I'd read most of the major studies that were around in the 60s and 70s.
Okay.
And I thought, well, maybe this is something worth exploring, because I had a theory at the time that the way to solve a lot of the problems, the social problems that I had been studying for years, was to empower women. And the empowerment of women would lead to stable families, stable environments, better schools, et cetera. So it was just a theory. And I was curious as to whether the work that Eva Davis and Renee Glover and Tom Cousins and Egbert Perry and other people were doing was actually an alternative to my own theory.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So curiosity has led me in most places. I don't usually go places I'm not interested in.
Yeah.
Or I go, but I'm not happy there. How about that? So I was led to it from that angle. And the more I got involved in it, I was just fascinated that they were basically piecing together, molding, developing a model to address what many of us who had studied was an age-old problem of depressed neighborhoods, not depressed people, depressed neighborhoods, underinvested, parts of town in every city that didn't seem to thrive.
Wow. Well, and I love the sociology side of kind of how that anthropology and how this is how, speaking of old, at some levels, place-based health is as old as humankind, right? We've been shaping civilizations together. That we would, if you pull out part of what it means to be a community, of course, people are going to struggle in those.
Well, and I had pursued some courses in African studies when I was an undergraduate. In those days, African studies was mostly a graduate program, and I convinced the department head to let me take these classes because there's, this is not this is the 60s. I went to college in 63, so just, what else was going on in the world then. So there was a lot of interest in the role of African traditions in the African American community. And so the more you learn about that, then you start studying not just cities and towns, but also villages. And how do they function? So
wow.
I don't think I've ever told that story before. I don't think you've ever heard it, David.
No, it's interesting.
I love that. The idea of the village. That's beautiful. How about for you? What
for
got
me,
you out of a very different world into all of this has defined your trajectory for so many years now.
For some reason or another that I still don't fathom, Shirley decided to hire me as her policy advisor.
So it's her fault, is what you're.
So I joined the city working for her in 2002, and I had no experience of working on city stuff.
Oh wow!
And so, it was all new to me.
Just his charm, was that it? Was it just his charm?
Well, it was hard to find anybody.
Exactly. It's more than desperation.
Scraping the bottom.
Exactly. But one of the things she'd asked me to do was, in my role as the policy advisor, was to look at sort of what was going on in the city. And when you start mapping outcomes, whether it be crime, whether it be vacancy rates in the city, whether it be education outcomes, it just jumps out at you that everything is geographically aligned, right? They all correlate with each other, and they all correlate with geography and neighborhoods. I can't say that we spent a lot of time talking about neighborhoods. There were only two things, I think, during our 8 years where neighborhoods were really kind of central to the work we were doing, and one was the Beltline, because we thought about the Beltline as a way of connecting neighborhoods, and 45 neighborhoods around the city, and we knew that there was going to be we knew there was going to be value generated by doing that. We didn't necessarily try to quantify it or really try to understand it in any real depth, but we just knew that kind of intuitively that these neighborhoods had been disconnected from the city, and connecting there would be some value there. And the other was what Renee Glover was doing over at the Housing Authority, where she was redeveloping the traditional public housing. We knew that was going to have impacts in those neighborhoods. Didn't spend a lot of time trying to analyze that or study that, but we knew that was going to be impactful. And it really wasn't until after Shirley was termed out in 2010, and I went to go work for IBM. We were hired by the city of Charlotte
Okay.
to look at their capital deployment process. Doesn't that sound like a boring project?
Man, I'm just like, so excited right now.
Exactly. It was really, and I didn't think much about it until I got onto the ground in Charlotte, and I realized what a huge challenge they were having politically, because this was in 2010, and as you know, that was the sort of the tail end of the recession.
Okay.
And the local governments had real financial struggles, and Charlotte was closing libraries, they were closing rec centers, and they were in the middle of a conversation on closing schools. And so they were getting a lot of criticism for the decisions they were making, and they were asking us to kind of validate the process they were using.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so we'll bring in some outside experts, they'll look at how we're doing this, they'll give us
Stamp of approval.
some stamp of approval. Exactly, that's what they were looking for. And so we dug into it, and we were looking at how they were making the decisions. And this is where the light went off for me. Because if you looked at any of those given silos, whether it be the schools, the rec centers, the libraries, what you realized was that inside those silos, they were making very sophisticated decisions. They were using the factors that you'd expect them to be using. The utilization, the state of the facilities, demand for those facilities.
Yeah.
But what we did was when we went to the city council to present our report, we put a map up of where these decisions were being made, like where these facilities were being closed. And that was where it all came together. Because even if you could justify the closure of a library or a school, when you add them all together and see that they were all being closed in the most disinvested neighborhoods in the city, the point we made to them was you're using the wrong criteria for making these decisions on a macro level. You're disinvesting in the neighborhoods that most desperately need investment.
Yeah.
And as a consequence of that, I wrote a white paper for IBM called the Neighborhood-Centric City.
Okay.
This is to where I said, we're not thinking about how we run government properly.
Yeah.
That the neighborhood is the unit of analysis. The neighborhood is the product that city governments are really in. And we're not organized that way.
Yeah.
We're organized in schools and water and parks and police.
Okay.
That's how we go to market in these silos.
Yeah.
But our customers care about, and what we should be caring about, is the experience that people have in their neighborhoods, and that's the lens through which we got to be making these decisions. So that's how I got interested in neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I love that neighborhood-centric city. How would you guys speak to what that means? Like, versus what would the other centricity be? Like, if we would advocate for neighborhoods to be the centering piece of a city versus something, what would the other version be, and what does a neighborhood-centric city look like, or how does it function differently?
Well, I can start. I'm sure Shirley have some opinions on this, but I would say right now we're not neighborhood-centric cities, and the reason we're not is because we built ourselves into these silos, and we still are. So, we're going through a budget process at the city right now, and who's presenting budgets? Well, the police department's presenting a budget, and the fire department's presenting a budget, and the parks department is presenting a budget, and they're looking at what they should be doing inside their silos. Nobody is going forward and say, this is what's in the best interest of Dixie Hills. This is what's in the best interest of Grove Park. This is what's in the best interest of Inman Park. Nobody's making that case. So we're not treating the city as a product, the neighborhood as a product of the city. That's simply not the way decisions are made. And it's not just city government. You go into the philanthropic sector. How are they organized? Health, education, green space. They're not organized around neighborhoods. That, to me, is the major disconnect. We are not making decisions in a way that drives and improves neighborhood health. And that's where I think we need to migrate to.
And that might be where we failed, because I'm talking about historically. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm certainly in the group of we when I speak in that we are government and the economy, everything is organized around institutions. And those institutions or agencies, agencies of government, have a very specific mission. And that mission doesn't really worry a whole lot about what anyone else is doing. So one of my examples of that is when I was in office, it became clear that one of the issues related to the crime in the city, the crime rate, was the truancy rate. But there are laws that prohibit the public school leaders to give me a list of the top 25 truants. Because my theory was, let's find out what's going on with the top 25 truants. And I don't know if you know this side of me, but I was going to meet with them and find them individually, talk to their families, and find out where the gaps were in their needs and maybe even their desires, and see if we could turn it around. Because if you can get the top 25 or 15 or 20 moving in the right direction, then you could create a model for what it would take. Well, there are federal laws that prohibit that.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because they're minors.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And the school couldn't share them with me. So the best we could do was to do a center where the police officers who were picking up truants at the request of the school system to take them to the center.
Okay.
And that center, run by the school system, could then try to work through whatever the remaining issues were. Of course, schools don't have the mandate, the budgets, or even the expertise to handle the myriad issues that might present themselves in a situation like that. And I use that as an example. It's not that the school's fault.
Yeah.
I'm not blaming anyone. I'm not blaming the parents or the young people. But obviously there's a disconnect if you don't go to school at all. If you miss 45 days of 90. If you miss half of your classes. But the model we have for governance actually helps to
keeps that all separated from each
keeps
other.
it all separate.
Interesting.
So, I mean, that's just an example of...
So it's like an institution-centric city versus a neighborhood-centric city that we
I'll give
approach
you-
it through institutions.
Exactly, and I'll give you, since Shirley raised it, I mean, Shirley, while we were mayor, spent an enormous amount of time meeting with every high school senior that would meet with her.
Oh,
She made
wow.
an offer to meet with every high school senior. And so we're all in the mayor's office. We're thinking, what is she doing? I mean, she thinks she's a school superintendent? Or is she thinking, But what I learned from that, and I didn't appreciate it at the time, but what I later really appreciated was what she was really instinctually saying is that if the city is producing happy, healthy, productive 18-year-olds, if every 18-year-old that comes out of the city of Atlanta is going to go off and lead a healthy, happy, productive life, then everything else is solved. I mean, that's it. That is the end game here. This is what we ought to be focused on. And it was only later that it became more obvious, I think, to Shirley and I when we started working with Purpose Built, is how hard that is to do if those kids are living in distressed, really toxic conditions. And so so while you want to help 18-year-olds as they are today to get forward in life, if we're really going to solve the problem, we need to make sure that those kids are born into healthy places that aren't rife with these sources of toxic stress that we now know impact their physical and neurological development. And so the end game now, from at least my perspective, is making sure that all of our neighborhoods are healthy, thriving places, such that any child born into those places has an equal chance to have a productive and healthy life. And that, to me, was the connection between Shirley's work with those kids and ultimately the focus on place.
I ran into a woman at a store about a month and a half ago. I don't know her name, and she said she had never met me, but wanted to thank me because her mother had 32 grandchildren. Wow. At the time her son was graduating from high school, and he was the first of 32 to have the opportunity to go to college. Wow. And it was all because of the intervention. And I'm not taking credit for it because I came up with an idea and a lot of other people had these skills to do it. But what I said is, okay, kids, I'm the mayor. I'm going to help you. Tell me what it requires, right? And it was a very low barrier, and which is the other thing I think that we learned from that. That there were literally no barriers. All they had to do was to show up and stay in school. And there's one young man from Carver who's still working at the city, who I met on a street corner over in the FCS neighborhood at 9:30 in the morning, sitting on a fence with another young man. I asked them to get in the car with me, and my police drivers thought I was crazy because they were sitting in the back of the car.
Lots of people thought Shirley was crazy.
We took them to breakfast on the condition they would go back to school. And at the end of the day, they would walk to City Hall and I would talk to them about what it was they needed.
Yeah.
They started working after school. And I mean, this story might even end up being cut from this. The one who was able to articulate what he wanted to do and who he wanted to be was the one I would have bet would have been the success. I ran into the other young man last year.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He works for the city of Atlanta. He started at 15 in 2003.
Okay, yeah.
He has a full-time job. He is the go-to person in general services.
Really? Wow.
He owns he's able to help his mother.
Yeah.
He has a house.
Wow.
He's living in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I would have never bet that he was the one. So the same month and a half, I'm running to somebody in the grocery store. And she says, whatever happened to this young man? And I said, oh, he's doing fine. He's working at the city. She said, I never would have guessed it. She was his caseworker in his classes because he was having so much trouble. And I told her, I said, he's doing better than we are. You know, he got a 15-year start on a career.
Yeah.
But it taught us a lot of lessons. It taught me a lot of lessons. There was a percentage of the students who were actually couch surfing, who did not live at home.
Yep.
There was a percentage of the students who were graduating, had no place to go home to. And that won't surprise you. There was a percentage of the students who just had no idea that they had a future. They knew they should finish high school, but they had no idea what the opportunities were. And frankly, you know, we talk to students as opposed to listening to students.
Yep.
And that's true in neighborhoods as well. I mean, telling sophisticated, successful people that they don't have the answers.
Yeah.
And I do think, I mean, that's part of the advantage of the neighborhood-centric. Because if you're working at the neighborhood level, you have to listen as much as you talk. If you bring solutions, maybe people will like them, maybe they won't.
Yeah.
As you've found in your work.
Yeah. And it just reaffirms we've been the object of disinvestment at your will and decision. And now you've changed your mind and you're investing in us, but it still feels like we're the object of being acted upon, right?
Exactly.
Versus like, yes, let's invest, but let's have that agency. Let's have that partnership, right, to do that stuff together.
And when people are living together and they're living in a community that has mixed income, mixed interests, mixed disciplinary interests, mixed political interests, you're much more likely to listen. Because you really don't know what your neighbor thinks.
Oh yeah. And so thinking about the kind of the philanthropic side of being place-based or neighborhood-centric, so what's the difference between community development, initiatives that are seeking to benefit people, whether it's students or otherwise, versus place-based community development? Like what's the distinguishing factor that takes a good program, a good initiative, a good intervention from being a good thing, a good community development action versus this is a place-based model? What's the difference between those?
Well, first of all, you have to define the place.
Okay, yeah.
So, I mean, there's a fair amount of work that goes into that. What is the place? You just can't pick a place. We're not building Brasilia, a new capital for the country. I mean, it is where people live and congregate. So you have to define the place. That's hard for some folks. They'd rather just serve anyone who shows up.
Okay, yeah.
And once you define the place, you have to take all of it.
Oh, wow, okay, yeah.
Not some of it. Not just housing, not just sidewalks, not just schoolyards, not just schools. You've got to take it all, and you're not sure what you'll find. So back in the 1990s when we started at Eastlake, and I don't know what the experience was at FCS, not a single person in a single community meeting for over 3 years that I attended, which was every neighborhood association meeting, every other meeting that was I could get into in the neighborhood, not a single person ever asked me about health care.
Interesting.
It never came up in the 1990s. You cannot go into a neighborhood or a community today and people do not talk about their health and wellness, their mental health, their physical health, their access to health care. You can't go anyplace today. So culturally, we've seen a huge shift.
Interesting, yeah.
And
we just had a focus group today downstairs on that very topic with residents from our neighborhood, yeah.
So those are just some initial ideas.
And I'd say there's a lot of kind of fuzzy thinking about what it means to be in the place-based transformation business. And the way I'm not sure everyone would agree with this, but the way I kind of think about it, well, there's this debate in the community development world between the people-based and the place-based world. And as I said earlier, all the efforts for the last 60 years have been almost entirely people-based. The theory being that people, if you could add capacity to individuals and families, you could help them improve the quality of their lives and change the trajectory of their lives. And the theory being we could end poverty through those people-based interventions. And I think my first statement would be I think we should just acknowledge that has failed. That has not been a successful approach. Therefore, the place-based approach is really about changing places. And so just because someone does a people-based service in a place does not make it a place-based effort. And the discipline that I would add is, what are you measuring and what outcome are you trying to drive? And if the outcome is not an improved place, a healthy neighborhood, then you're not in the place-based business, even though it may feel like you're.
You could even be in housing and not be doing place-based work.
Exactly. You could be in housing. You could be running a YMCA. You could be running after-school programs for kids in that neighborhood. None of those things are necessarily going to change the place. It has to be, and as Shirley mentioned, you have to look at the entire place. And just trying to do housing or health or recreation or education alone is not going to drive the change in these places. And I think that's been pretty evident in the work around the country. So to me, if you are trying to change the conditions in a neighborhood, you're trying to change the fundamental conditions in which kids are being raised, then you're in the place-based business.
Yeah. And I love what you said about if you're taking the place, you got to take all of it, right? And so I think there's some really brilliant people on the FCS team when it comes to housing, because when you hear them thinking through housing, though affordability is obviously a top priority for us, they're really analyzing on how will this house impact this block, how will this block impact this neighborhood. So they're trying to carry the whole neighborhood into any decision that they're making about a housing move or products in the store. And so I love that phrase: if you're going to take the neighborhood, you got to take all of it. And that commitment to is what we're doing, making the neighborhood healthy, right? And I think even for legitimately place-based organizations, it can get really easy to only be thinking in a measuring sense on, well, what's the impact on this family that we've housed? We got to have impact measurements. So we don't just count our houses, we count what happened to the families. But even that's still not necessarily asking, is the neighborhood as a whole getting healthier? And
so my work in sociology and certainly African studies and anthropology, the question too is, it's sustainable? I mean, I've lived in Atlanta long enough to see one housing project rebuilt twice. In other words, well, actually, I've seen it rebuilt twice, and it was already there. So it wasn't new. I mean, literally, completely renovated, tens of millions of dollars spent. So what's missing? It's not $50, $60 million. That's part of it. But there was no effort to really develop a place. So that was a community, doesn't matter what neighborhood it is, had no grocery store, had schools that were not performing for students, as opposed to students who were not performing. You notice schools that were not performing for students. It did not have access to jobs. It did not have a sense of neighborhood engagement and decision making. I mean, just on and on and on. So it's... I think what we've seen is this: you have to stabilize it over time. It has to be economically stable. It has to be a healthy place to live. In other words, the air has to be clean, the water, I have to talk about water. The water has to be clean, all the infrastructure has to be in place, the physical infrastructure, the broadband, whatever the infrastructure of the period is, and the housing. And then I think you also have to see the growth of some institutions that are focused and living and breathing in the community, that are taking care of the place.
Yeah. And I think that's the immeasurable, but I think probably the most impactful thing that is not talked about in a lot of, because there's huge affordable housing conversations in Atlanta, as there should be. And in a lot of those, it's housing, and we're not thinking about, will people be placed? They will be housed, but will they be placed? And it's, who are the people giving that care to that social fabric is rarely talked about, at least in our perspective. And at least from our 20 years in historic South Atlanta, that we would say even more important than the hundreds of housing units or whatever, it really is that fabric of neighborhood voice and agency and the way it's connected. So just that level of who's giving care to the city.
And I think that's becoming more broadly understood. And I'll just give a shameless plug to my current boss. Hopefully he's not listening. I don't like to compliment him when he's in earshot. But when he talks about, he made a commitment on the campaign about either building or preserving 20,000 housing units in the city of Atlanta. And he would be the first to say that if we woke up tomorrow with that goal reached, if we woke up tomorrow and there were 20,000 new or preserved housing units in the city and they were all in deeply distressed neighborhoods, he'd be the first to say that we will have accomplished nothing.
Oh, wow.
And so housing is a instrument for helping to improve the health of neighborhoods, but it's not an end in and of itself.
That's good.
And we've got to always bear that in mind, that it's a complementary set of investments that we need to make, really to. And we haven't really talked about the origin of all this, but it's important that we recognize the reason we're in the situation that we're in Atlanta and every other city that I've worked in, is because we've had generations of these racialized policies, these malintended public policies that were explicitly intended to segregate the city and concentrate poverty, basically create a divided city. And if you look any statistic about the city of Atlanta, it's completely divided in this regard. And so and that is the most pernicious consequence of that history, of these distressed neighborhoods. And if we're ever going to have anything approximating reparative justice in this country, it's going to have to be to reinvest in these neighborhoods and making sure that every child that's born in those neighborhoods is in a position to lead a healthy and thriving life. And that, to me, is the central strategic imperative for any city, and certainly for a city like Atlanta that really should be a leader in addressing this history.
Yeah.
And I would say, but you also, if you empower the person, let's say the child, and they have to move out because they're not comfortable in the place, they make it out, as opposed to...
That used to be the success story, too.
That was a success story.
Look at all these kids who got out of the bad neighborhood.
Exactly. And that's really the busing model.
Yeah.
In school desegregation. Not saying that it was a strategy to accommodate the historic past and the history of segregation, and to do it quickly. And I'm not suggesting it. I mean, they were trying to figure out what to do and what can we do today, right?
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, we know now that investing in the neighborhood would probably have been a better solution, and then in the neighborhood school.
And we won't deal with racial equity if we don't deal with neighborhoods, right? I mean, to your point, like we got where we are because of deliberate choices and decisions, whether it be private or public. This was made, and like any movement for racial justice is a place-based conversation.
Well, the best quote I've heard, so Brian Stevenson, who spoke at our Purpose Book conference a couple years ago, he said, "We know our work will be done when our neighborhoods are no longer expressions of injustice."
Wow.
And so to have, so he understood it intuitively, that this is a geographic problem, and so that to me is the end game here.
Yeah.
Unless we're focused on that, then we're not working on the right things.
So what changes have happened from a city level perspective in Atlanta last couple of decades, or even more recently, that has helped more of a neighborhood-centric work to happen? What have we seen, whether it's policy decisions or investment decisions? How has Atlanta made shifts to allow neighborhoods to be more of a center
So
concern.
I want to say something just before we get to that,
Yeah.
which is we didn't get in this situation overnight.
Yeah. Oh.
I mean, it's been generations, and it's been accepted both by blacks and whites and other people over generations. So it's also a cultural shift. It's a shift in philosophy. It's a shift in program. It's a shift in investment, and in institutions. But it's also a cultural shift, and so we have to be aware that cultural shifts doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
You know, one of my mentors said to me when I went into city government to work for Andy Young, he said, you know, the city is like the Queen Mary. It doesn't turn on a dime.
Yeah. Yeah.
It has to be steered. You have to pilot it. You have to strategize. I mean, some of the things that we do have long-term turnaround.
Yeah.
And you're not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
So one of my stories that I've just started to tell is that when Andy Young was in office in the 1980s, he was toward the end of his term, and he had decided to join Billy Payne and others to go after the Olympics. So he came to the staff, me included, and said, well, I'm going to go off and do this, and you can do the rest of the work that we promised to do. And I was like, really? I mean, but anyway, one of the things he wanted to accomplish then, this is 1989-ish, 90, is that he wanted to build 25,000 housing units in the city. Because he said, the city needs to be repopulated. Because remember now, there had been white flight, there had been middle class flight of many backgrounds, and he could foresee a demand for housing, even though at the time most people thought that the development in the metro area was going to be exclusively outside the city. And people articulated that, the 80s and the 80s and the early 90s. And he put that on the table in the last couple of years, and we basically threw up our hands and said we couldn't do it. I mean, we had a number of other things that we hadn't done, and the hadn't completed, and he was going to go off and get the Olympics, so we were short a person, right? So I remember saying to him, I mean, somebody else is going to have to do that. And the truth of the matter is, until Andre came, and we did a little bit of that study with Trammell Crow and what's Ron's last name? Tulliger, on housing and affordability. But what we really needed to do would have, at the time, we thought required a change in the state constitution.
Oh, really? Wow.
And we couldn't figure out a way to make the change.
What kind of things live at that level that prevent this from happening in a city?
Well, we wanted, what's it called? Mandatory inclusionary zoning.
Oh, okay,
So anytime you build, you had to build affordability into your,
Oh, wow, okay.
regardless of whether you had city funds or public funds or not. And there are communities that have tried that. I haven't studied them, David, but there are a few smaller communities that have tried that. It would have also led us to think about, although I'm not sure I would have advocated, is to modify our zoning so that you could have more flexibility in the zoning law. So that's another thing that lives there.
I was just reading something the other day. I'll have to put it in show notes of the exact numbers, but just the sheer number of, or the percentage number of land that's dedicated in cities to single-family housing only, that's all that you're legally allowed to do, just astronomical numbers. I'm like, oh my God.
75% or something.
It was like
well, that's what I'm saying.
70%. I'm like, how in the world do we address all this stuff if that, I mean, 3/4 of our land is dedicated to only.
Well, some cities have tried to undo that. It's very controversial. But some cities have tried, I think they're mostly in the West, have tried to talk about changing zoning so that you have more flexibility within the zoning to build multi-units.
But the good news is, and I was just in a meeting today with some developers, and I'm constantly having to remind folks that we are not, and this is Atlanta speaking, but we are not San Francisco or Washington or New York. I mean, we have massive undeveloped land in this city. I mean, the city itself and its public sector partners have 2,000 acres of undeveloped property. And so, and just around the corner from here, there's 120 acres of public property. So the good news for Atlanta, and I'm really amused by that Andrew Young story, because 1989 was when crime peaked in the city of Atlanta. And so I find it hard to believe that anybody at a mayor at that point could look at his city, which had been shrinking for 2 decades and had crime at the levels that it was, and say, we ought to be building more housing. That's a
visionary. He's seeing something way
I spent enough time with Andrew to know that he's an optimistic guy, but that's the peak optimistic. But to answer your earlier question about what's fundamentally helping to drive this work, I'd say that's it. I mean, the fact that people are moving back into cities and have been in earnest, and really in the last 30 years, change is a game changer. Because if this was 1975, we wouldn't be doing this work. Because you've got to have people wanting to live in cities and be part of that urban experience. You've got to have that market interest to do any of this work. You can't be begging and pleading for people to move into the city, which is what they were doing in the 70s and 80s. And so fundamentally, the fact that cities are now places, desirable places, particularly for young people to live, that is a kind of fundamental precept for all of this. And there are cities in this country that don't have that, and they can't do this work successfully, in my opinion. You've got to have this impetus to come into the city.
And how do we do, so I mean, obviously with the rapid growth of Atlanta, a lot more investments coming, private, public, and otherwise. And there's even an attention for a lot of people to say, hey, we want to show more concern. Like, there's a greater awareness and acceptance that, yes, we've had racialized policies and investments for generations. It's left us here. We want to change the trajectory of these neighborhoods, but as we've seen, so a lot of that change happens so quickly that the people who've been there don't get the benefit from it, right? They're displaced in some way. Or the design or development happens really reflects the identity of the people we're trying to recruit to move in versus really reflecting the culture of people who are there. So how do we leverage this opportunity of more people wanting to be here, but doing that development in such a way that really honors the legacy that's there and the residents that are already there?
That's you put your finger on the toughest challenge on this, and it's part of the challenge is just framing it properly, because when you go into neighborhoods today, particularly our distressed neighborhoods, the first thing that you recognize is that they are incredibly unstable places. So there are people moving in and out of these neighborhoods, and it shows up in the schools data. So we have elementary schools in the city where half the kids leave over the course of a school year.
Good grief.
That's not even including the summer.
Wow.
I mean, between August and May, half the kids leave.
Good grief.
That means those families are constantly on the move. And so when you're talking about displacement, it's first important to remember that people are self-displacing for some good reasons, some for bad reasons, right? But they are constantly in the move. So stabilizing the neighborhood has really got to be one of the first priorities.
The first actions,
How do you give families the ability or a reason to stay in their neighborhood? When Greg Giornelli started purpose-built schools here in the Carver District, one of the first things he did when he was looking at these transiency numbers was he asked the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Association to come in and provide housing legal support for his families, because he recognized that nothing that he could do inside that school. There's no amount of teacher training or principal recruitment.
Kids are out the door and back in.
If they're losing those kids at the rate that they were losing, and he was able to cut the transiency rate in half, I think, in the first couple of years.
Wow.
That is a much stronger indicator of a school performance than anything that's going inside the classroom. But if you go to to APS and say, you're really in the housing business. If you really want to improve your outcomes, you should be in the housing business. And there are superintendents. I think Superintendent Herring gets that, and I think Superintendent Kostarfin got that. But I don't think the school as a whole, I don't think the school, going back to the silo conversation, they don't see themselves as being in the neighborhood business. They see themselves as being in the schools business. And they're only willing to pull the levers that are inside the schools. And our point would be, you're never going to create high quality schools if you don't create stable, healthy neighborhoods in which those schools can function.
That's great. That's great. I mean, what moving forward, what additional changes would you like to see happen, whether it's city level, state level, federal level? What do you think are some, like zoning, for example? What are some of the things that are getting in the way of us being able to be neighborhood-centric, or to help stabilize neighborhoods so they can develop in a healthy way? What are some things that you would like to see change? Are there things on Mayor Dickens' mind that he would love to see change that would allow Atlanta neighborhoods to do better? What are some of those?
Well, one of the things that when Greg and David and I were all working together at Purpose-Built Communities, one of the things that we challenged ourselves on was, are there any restrictions in the city's charter or codes or state law that prohibits the city from investing in neighborhood and place-based work? And we couldn't find any. Now that I've said it, somebody's going to go try to find something. But so if you start from the assumption that the city can actually be an investor.
Oh wow! Yeah. Yep.
Not just receive philanthropic funds, not just tax credits, but an actual investor, and an investor in what that neighborhood needs, not what we think it needs.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay? I mean, maybe what they need is year-round school. And maybe APS is not interested in that. Is the city in a position to invest in
making that happen?
That time frame? I'm using, that's a broad Can we invest in early childhood education? We all know if the best dollar spent in education is between 6 weeks and 5 at least, right? That's the best dollar. So, there are a number of things like that I would hope the city and other cities would think about. And I'm still a fan of mandatory inclusionary zoning. Something that says, that a community says, a city says, we believe that it should be possible for people of all incomes and backgrounds to live anywhere. So if you were going to be in our city, that is our vision of who we want to be. And I think we've now built a city. I would not say that other people are, the former elected officials were wrong, because I think we've built the kind of reputation, brand, and amenities that now attract people to the city. People, Arthur Blank is, the Falcons and the Atlanta United play in downtown because it's a good business decision. It's a good business decision. It's a good business decision to be associated with a city that has the colleges and universities within 5 minutes of each other. And the research. There are a lot of good business reasons to be in the city, and a lot of. But what happens is in neighborhoods that have not had investment, they don't see any of those advantages. They've never walked down the street. They've never been to the college. They don't have occasion to go to Georgia Tech or Morehouse or Spelman, or just to see what it's like. Except maybe to work and not to study. So, those are just some thoughts.
So here's a federal idea. So, when I was at Purpose-Built, we did an analysis just to determine how many of these distressed neighborhoods are there out there.
Oh, wow.
Because, our job was to replicate this model, the successful model in Eastlake. And we were working in, a couple of dozen of them. But the question that was raised was, well, are we making a dent in this problem? How big is this problem? And so we did some analysis, and it turns out, plus or minus some percentage, we think there's about 800 of them. 800 distressed urban neighborhoods in this country. Now, if you were to do the math on what it would take to do what we were doing at Purpose-Built, what the resources that we typically would spend in a Purpose-Built revitalization project, you could do all 800 of them for about $400 billion. Now, that might seem like a lot of money. That's 5% of one federal budget. 5% of one federal budget. We spend about $1 trillion a year on anti-poverty stuff. It is about 20% of what we just spent on the pandemic. So this is not a large amount of money, but it would be a huge investment in reparative justice in this country. And in fact, it would be, to me, the most obvious place. If we're talking about any kind of reparative justice or reparations of any type, investments in these neighborhoods would be the most impactful way of deploying resources. And so I was with HUD this week. They were in town to interview our teams because we are finalists for a Choice Neighborhood Implementation Grant over in Bowen Homes. And the good news is there's 8 finalists, and they're making 6 awards this year. And those awards are about $40 to $50 million. That's great. They should be doing 60 of those, not 6 a year. And that would be a game changer for this work and for these communities. And so that, to me, at the federal level, that's the most obvious.
Wow.
The fact that they're even doing Choice Neighborhood, which just came out of the Obama administration, is a huge step forward, because the federal government didn't think about neighborhoods at all for all those years. So that's I think a sea change in attitudes at the federal level. But to me, it's just about resourcing, and this is not a lot of money compared to the outcomes that we would be generating, and the return on that investment would be enormous.
Well, I mean, if you think about the Atlanta airport or the water and sewer system, just talk about those two. I mean, the city has invested time, energy, talent, and money in both of those operations for close to 100 years. Certainly the water system. The airport a little less than that years. But it takes that level of energy. And when we were in office, when I was in office, David is still at City Hall. I mean, we said, okay, we need to do an affordable housing bond issue. And we came up with $75 million. I don't remember how we calculated it. We spent about $35 million as mostly gap financing in affordable housing, things like stable housing for people at risk of homelessness. And those were project-based, not neighborhood-based initiatives. But my sense of it when I left office shortly and when I started working in purpose-built was the city probably needs to find a way to spend $100 million a year for 10 years or more. Because I think this is a 20 to 25 year initiative. We'll begin to see changes in less time than that, which will satisfy all the elected officials. But it's going to take that level of money and investment. And I'm just picking a number. But $1 billion investment would pay off just think about the Beltline.
You might make more money than you're investing because of the changes that would be made, right? It's
Absolutely.
It's not just a idea that all the money goes out the door.
It doesn't all go out the door. Some of it comes back to you. Some of it comes back to you. And if you make that kind of investment, you probably could reduce the cost of living. As most people would say, well, you're just going to raise my taxes. No, not really. Because there'd be other items that you could decrease. The famous, I haven't looked at it closely recently, but this notion that firefighters fight fires. They do, but very few. Because the federal law changed, the state building codes changed, the materials changed, behavior changed. I would be surprised that 20% of a firefighter's time is spent fighting fires now.
Well, the fun statistic is, and this is a national number, but on average, so we have fire departments because we have structural fires. I mean, that's why they exist, because houses and ultimately neighborhoods would burn. And we've had them in Atlanta and those are the days when all the houses were made out of wood and people had opened fires and they were smoking all the time. And so you had all these fires. So it was very natural that you needed to have lots of firehouses strategically deployed in neighborhoods because you had to respond quickly, otherwise the whole neighborhood might go in flames. That infrastructure, firehouses in all these neighborhoods, that still exists. But we don't have houses like that. Our houses aren't made out of inflammable wood, and and people aren't smoking in bed, and people don't have open flames everywhere in their homes, and candles and all these things that are good. And yet we still invest in the same infrastructure. So the fun statistic is, on average, The average firefighter in this country responds to a structural fire once every 2 years.
Oh my gosh.
Right? So now they're in the business of, emergency medical response, and they go, and if there's a car accident, they show up. So it's not that you don't need those kinds of personnel, but that's not how we are organized. We're organized to fight structural fires. We have all these ladder trucks and all these neighborhood-based fire homes. So I mean, I've looked pretty hard at that over the years, and there's a real strong case can be made that we could rethink the whole way we deal with that aspect of public safety. But the same thing goes for police. I mean, people don't necessarily know this, but crime in the city of Atlanta is down 80% since the time Andrew Young talked about building housing in 1989. 80% reduction in crime since then, and that's not rate; that's the actual numbers of crime.
Oh wow!
And so that suggests you would think that would suggest, well, let's look at again our policing infrastructure. We have, if any other business that I've worked in, if you lost 80% of your inputs, you would at least start a conversation about whether we need the same infrastructure. So that, all those kind of questions come into play when you start thinking about what are the advantages of changing conditions in these neighborhoods, because they do have, as Shirley said, they do have positive impacts on the operating requirements of the city, and that you could actually find savings that you can end up deploying to these things.
But part of the challenge here is people, in order to make this affordable and sustainable, and actually so that you can sell it to the broader public that may not be in a disinvested neighborhood, is that you've got to do the whole, you have to do place-based, but you also have to be looking at transformation of how you deliver services and what you're delivering. Because if you're just adding to what you're already doing, you're probably overspending. If in fact you are transforming the way government responds, and if you're transforming that at the same time you're adding, you're probably going to spend less money. But I mean, that's a topic for another day. And you may be talking to two of the people out of 500,000
that actually believe this
in Atlanta who believe this. Okay.
But I think even to the numbers you were giving, like we're already spending more than that in poverty alleviation programs that at best have shown it helps people survive for a month at a time, and then they keep surviving the next month, right? So we're already investing more than is potentially necessary, right? So like it's this. There's a professor at UPenn that I talked to about a year or so ago that was doing a research project, I think in New York City, and they were looking at how much money the city spends annually per chronically street homeless individual.
Oh yeah.
It's like if you take that same dollar amount, not even more, just do it differently, like you'll save money. Like the city changes when you invest it differently.
Or not spend any more.
Yeah.
And have a better outcome, and better outcome in that it's a sustainable outcome as opposed to a patchwork system. But I mean, to get back to the primary topic, which is neighborhood-centric, neighborhood-based, place-based, is I believe, the most likely way to break through chronic, multi-generational disinvestment and poverty in an urban setting like Atlanta. Now, would this work in another city? I don't know. David might have opinions about that. I don't know whether this works in Houston or Baltimore or someplace else. We've seen it work in a couple of communities. I mean, Omaha is an example. Wilmington, Charlotte.
Some example. You guys have a unique seat, both from in Atlanta. You've seen the dynamic of over 240 neighborhoods, but also your time at Purpose-Built, you've seen these over 24 network members that are in the U.S. Like, what are some signs of hope for you, or some signs of success that you've seen this place-based model?
Well, I mean, I think this starts with, and to Shirley's point, what's remarkable is that one of the things I was able to do at Purpose-Built was to travel around the country and work. I was working in probably over 50 cities over the course of those 6 or 7 years, and the problems are the same. I mean, you go into every neighborhood in these cities, and they're effectively the same problem. And then when you read Richard Rothstein's book, Color of Law, it comes as no surprise that the problems are the same, because the causes are all the same. I mean, basically, all those public policies that we were implementing during the post-war period particularly, they were the same everywhere. San Francisco, Dallas, New York, Atlanta, didn't matter where you were. We were purposely trying to isolate and concentrate black people into very specific neighborhoods and isolate them and cut them off from the city. And that was going on universally around the country. So it should come as no surprise then that the opportunity to apply the same solution should present itself. And that's what I think that's what the opportunity is. And the biggest challenge is in doing that is that what we spent our time doing was convincing school superintendents and housing authority directors and mayors that they ought to be focused on neighborhoods. And they are not, as we talked about earlier. They simply do not think about neighborhoods as being, and so why it would take us a couple of years to get a project even going, because I was spending my time trying to convince school boards that they ought to be making a different set of decisions about their schools in order to advance a neighborhood, or a housing authority director. And as Shirley mentioned earlier, unless you have all the pieces together, it doesn't work. So all it takes is one housing authority director to say, "Well, I'm not doing that," or some change in the school superintendent. You know, they're changing every 3 years, and so and then all of a sudden you're starting from scratch. And so the problem is, again, we're not organized around solving this problem. And so the key, and again, the credit goes to Mayor Dickens again. He has assembled the leaders of all of the local agencies, so MARTA and Atlanta Beltline and APS and Atlanta Housing, Invest Atlanta. They're all meeting periodically. I am meeting with their staff every 2 weeks.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And we're focused on 6 specific neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta, and we are applying a holistic transformational model in conjunction with the residents of those neighborhoods. So we're doing this, and it only is working is because we have those agencies aligned, strategically aligned, and this is all because of the leadership of this mayor. And I think it's a game changer. It hasn't happened anywhere else in the country. I think it's a model that will get a lot of notice once we've really begun the work, and it's really it's Mayor Dickens' leadership that's made all this happen.
And then the key is that they not just do it now, but they institutionalize it in a way that it continues.
Keeps going.
Post. His.
Because the way cycles go with
8 years,
administration or whatever,
Exactly.
because like you said earlier, this is a 20-year arc, and like we don't have offices that last for 20 years.
Well, and to Shirley's credit, the reason the Beltline, the reason we have a thing called Atlanta Beltline Inc. and Atlanta Beltline Partnership is because she recognized that this thing was not going to get done in the term that while she was in office, and that so you needed to create an organization that was more. You can't completely insulate it from political changes, but you can pretty much isolate it as much as you can so that it has its own momentum and its own support and its own sources of funding and those kinds of things to be able to deliver that work. Because the Beltline we thought was going to take 25 years, and it's going to take 25 years. It turns out, right? And I think this, to Shirley's point earlier, this is 25-year work. I mean, this is not something that happens overnight. If we could have done the Beltline in 3 years, we would have just done it in the city. Right? But we knew we couldn't get it done in 3 years, so it had to be done outside of city government. I think this work is very similar.
And you have to have some institutional base. It cannot, I mean, if you're really trying to do this, it cannot be dependent, in my view, it cannot be dependent on, it's more likely to get done by municipal leadership or local government leadership than it is very wonderful private sector partners. You've got to know that FCS can be here another 25 to 50 years. I mean, you've done an amazing amount of work in a couple of decades, but the fact of the matter is you're still not there.
Oh, I know, right,
So there needs to be a way to ensure that you are going to be able to continue to do this work. And you're not waiting for the latest federal program.
People have been surprised actually that FCS has, and even until recently, really even hasn't touched much federal funding until the most recent part of our history. And like, have you guys done this much? Like, and part of it's been like, because there's so much change and evolution, we've always felt nervous about like, what are we going to like lean into, depend upon, and that gets kind of cut out from under us. Like, but I feel like the organization's matured enough to where we can use those things as like assets to help.
Right.
Well, one of the things that, you've been operating at a disadvantage, as has the Eastlake Foundation and the Grove Park Foundation and the West Side Future Fund and all your kind of sister community quarterback organizations, because you have been almost entirely a private sector driven effort. You've not had mayors, you've not had city councils, you not have had MARTAs and housing authorities as being true partners in this work.
Yeah.
And that slows you down. I mean, as you know, it slows you down dramatically. I mean, it makes it, you're constantly swimming upstream. And so what excites me, and the reason I went to come work for the city again, is to have a city government with a mayor and all of these agencies aligned. To me, it's a game changer.
That's exciting
for folks. I mean, you guys know this better than anybody. How you're constantly fighting City Hall. Even when I've worked with mayors around the country, mayors are often helpful. I mean, they say they want to help, and they may do a few things, but they're not taking ownership of it. They're not really saying, I am tying the success of my administration to your success. And that's really what I think is different in this circumstance. And if this is ever going to scale, not only in Atlanta, but elsewhere, I think that's the change that's got to happen. The government, the public sector has to see this as a core strategic imperative.
Well, one final question. You guys have been amazing to talk to. What gives you, so I'm set up why I'm asking this. So, obviously FCS, like you guys, our hearts and heads and bodies are fully engaged in some of our society's most challenging issues day in and day out. So one of our values here is to try to have a lot of fun and, just have joy, celebrate when we can and that kind of thing. So one of the things we try to come back to is all right, what's giving you hope right now, right? Because it's 20 years, it's 50 years, it's generational. I know that this work is going to long outlast my lifespan, right? So this is really big. And so it's, for us, trying to always come back to what are the things that give hope for the continued kind of joy and focus of the work. So what about that for you guys? What's giving you
So in 1996, when I was asked to work with Greg Gianelli and the team out at Eastlake, the theory was that there would only be one project like that in Atlanta. And that it was not possible to do without a private sector, single champion and philanthropist. We have evolved from that to 3 or 4 different initiatives just in the city. And now, only 20 years later, 25 years later, we have a mayor and David and a team of people who say, no, we can do this all over Atlanta. So that's not such a long time for a change. So I am hopeful about it because I've seen it. I mean, we ourselves said at Eastlake, no, and even when we got to Purpose Built, when the early days at Purpose Built, we said, oh, we can do this in other cities, but we won't be able to do it again in Atlanta. And the couple of years you spent, David, getting to know FCS, I won't even share with you our first conversation about that. I'll tell you that off mic. But, and Grove Park.
Yeah.
I mean, up until very, very close to their real launch, there was great skepticism in this community about whether they would be able to sustain that initiative. I don't know if you.
Thank you for telling that.
No,
So
all of that is resonating. So the question, what gives me hope? So when we had the Black Lives Matters protests back in, I guess it was the spring of 2020, Shirley and I actually wrote an op-ed for the AJC. It's a short little thing, and it basically said, we are over-policed and under-invested in neighborhoods. And our point, our attempt, however modest it was to change the axis of the conversation. Because at the time, people were talking about policing as being the problem. And our point was that policing is not the problem. And we're not going to train police our way out of this problem of racial inequities in our cities, that we really need to focus on the root causes of that, and which is what we just spent the last hour talking about, which are these disinvested communities. So what gave me hope then, what gives me hope now, is that I really do feel like there's been an inflection point in the willingness of the country to really attack this issue of racial inequities in our country in a much more authentic way than we have in the past. And so, that is, and people are when you talk to people who just spend their time, getting their news from the national media, they all seem very depressed about the state of things, right? But I can tell you, from working inside the city, I get none of that. I mean, I just, like I said, I was in a meeting this morning with a bunch of developers, most of whom I would imagine are Republican, and they were enthusiastic supporters of this work. They get it.
Wow.
You don't have to convince them of anything, and they're happy to participate. And so I think the what excites me about the opportunity is that we have not only, I think, the public sector unity as I described under this mayor, but I think we have the private and philanthropic community that is prepared to do this, and so I actually am very optimistic, but I'm optimistic by nature, Shawn. So maybe that's a false optimism, but I definitely I wouldn't be getting up every day to do this work if I didn't feel like we could actually deliver it. So that's what gives me optimism and hope.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to both of you just to learn from you, to be a part of this. This is just
Well, you've done great work.
Oh yeah, thank you.
And you have to be optimistic about it.
You have to, yeah. I mean,
You have to be.
Particularly when you're in. So one of the things I'll just say this as a kind of a sidelight, but the 8 years I spent working for Shirley were the best 8 years of my career. They're also the lowest paid 8 years of my career. But what I loved about Shirley was she could find the humor.
That's great.
In everything. Because when you work in City Hall, you can imagine the crises that come up all the time, right? And it's so important. And the way I describe it is there are two kinds of bosses out there. I'm not sure how you would describe your bosses here, but I think there are two kinds of bosses. There are kind of bosses that absorb pressure and the kinds of bosses that amplify pressure. And so Shirley was a pressure absorber. Like she would always take whatever was happening and she would figure out a way to not just put it on your back. She would always find a way to and I just remember we just spent a lot of time laughing in the mayor's office. That was like a lot of laughs. It made up for the poor pay and working conditions.
Well, we had a lot of chocolate too.
We had a lot of chocolate. That's right.
We had a lot of chocolate, drank a lot of Cokes and coffee and stuff. But I thank you very much, and thank you for your work.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
This is really what a treat. Thank you so much for this.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Place Matters is produced by Focused Community Strategies, whose mission is to partner with under-resourced neighborhoods to provide innovative and holistic development that produces flourishing communities and God's shalom. Place Matters is hosted by FCS's training and consulting team, known as the Lupton Center. If you would like to inquire about our training and consulting services, please reach out to us via our website or find us on LinkedIn and social media. This information can be found in the show notes. If you would like to watch these episodes, the videos can be found on our YouTube channel. And if you like these episodes, please share them on social media. Your support means a lot to us. This show was edited by Tim Rhodes with music by Eric North. Special thanks to David Park and Becca Malpass at FCS for their work in organizing and recording these sessions. We'd also like to say thank you to our partner, Lilly Endowment, whose Thriving Congregations grant has made this podcast possible.